Hey, everybody, welcome to the show. And today I get to sit with my new friend, Simon K. Jones, who is the founder of the successful Substack publication Write More with Simon K. Jones and is the author of Tales from the Triverse. Simon, welcome to the show.
Hi, Johnny. Thanks for having me on.
It's so good to see you, man. I've been inspired, even just our talks prior to this, I've been inspired by what you're accomplishing in the world and the way you're doing it. So will you start us off with a defining moment in your life?
Defining moment. Well, I guess in the context of kind of what I do with the newsletter, the big one was when my son was born, and you have far less time to do all the things that you would otherwise be doing. So, when I was a student and in my 20s, had infinite time and did very little with it, right?
I remember.
All the books I could have written and didn't. But then kind of counterintuitively, when you suddenly have hardly any time at all, you're like, oh, I need to actually make the most of this time. So you kind of recalibrate things a little bit. And that was when I realized that I hadn't become a writer in quite the way I'd intended to, I suppose, when I was a kid. And that was the point at which I was like, right, I need to get on with this, and started writing more frequently and more regularly. And then it turned out that was actually basically the catalyst that got me going, and I've been writing ever since then, and have put together 4 serial projects which have been completed and have accumulated all these readers through the newsletter that I didn't expect. And I don't think any of that would have probably happened if I hadn't had that kind of jarring realization that I was never going to have more time. You have that thing when you you can have it for all sorts of reasons, I think, but for me it was seeing a child growing up, and then that also emphasizes to you that you're getting older as well. And that sudden kind of being able to visualize the end point, I suppose, and being like, oh, there's some things I want to do between now and then. Let's get on with it.
Yeah. So that you had a moment that kind of grounded you in the reality of time, right? And time is a finite resource. What was the dream that you had as a kid that was the catalyst for this revelation? What was that?
I think I always wanted to tell stories in some capacity. So when I was really young, I was really into comics and wanted to be a comics writer. And then it was a novelist, and being a novelist stayed there for a long time. That kind of then shifted in my teens into filmmaking, and I went and studied film at university. Ended up working for a tech company that did visual effects for student filmmakers. So that kind of seemed like the route I was going down, and did some short films with friends and that kind of thing. But the thing with film is that if you don't go really seriously into it, and if you don't have a budget, you kind of hit a ceiling in terms of what you can actually achieve. It can be great fun, and you can do cool stuff, but there's a sort of ceiling beyond which you either go, okay, either I put lots of money into this, or figure out how to raise money, or it's always going to look a bit like an amateur thing, which is fine if that's what you're going to do. But I was like, that's not quite right. And then again, once you start having kids, and in friendship groups, when everyone starts having kids kind of roughly the same time, it then becomes incredibly difficult to organize something like a film shoot and get everyone in the same place. And that was in my early 30s. I was then like, oh, actually, I used to want to be a novelist. And the thing about writing a book is that you don't have to organize a whole crew and figure out a shooting schedule and where you're going to go on location and do all this kind of stuff. You just need a pen, and that's it. And it's really easy. And you can do 5 minutes in between all the other stuff you're trying to do and make incremental progress. And that kind of then linked me back to where I started, I suppose.
So what was it about Substack that poured gasoline on the fire, or made things possible for you in a different way?
Yeah, that was quite unexpected, I suppose. So I started, I think, around 2015, dabbling with serialization and telling stories in that way. But I don't think Substack existed back then. So what I ended up, it was on this website called Wattpad, which is a kind of huge YouTube-style website for words. It's free to use, anyone can put stuff up, a bit like YouTube. That means it's full of all sorts of stuff from the whole spectrum of quality, and it was great for a few years. And I ended up with the first serial I did, which was very much an experiment, but that's ended up having over 100,000 reads, And this blew my mind at the time, because having not really written anything, to suddenly have actual people reading it was a very strange experience. But over time, it's one of those platforms, like most social platforms, I suppose, where you don't have any particular agency or control over what's actually happening on it.
Yep.
Even less so than some others, in fact. So that was kind of unsatisfying, because whether a story did well or didn't do well didn't necessarily feel like it was anything to do with me. It felt like it was to do with their algorithm doing something which you couldn't really replicate.
Yes.
Then must have been 2020 or 2021, I think. I was working at the National Centre for Writing in the UK at the time, and I was producing their podcast, and we got on Elle Griffin, who had just moved to Substack and was writing all sorts of interesting stuff. She was serializing her own story. She's kind of shifted into kind of cultural writing now, and is very successful at doing it. But she talked all about Substack, and it sounded really interesting. So I just took a look at it, and it's this kind of, particularly at the time, it was this kind of weird blend of blog and newsletter. So it was like taking a WordPress blog and like a MailChimp newsletter, both of which I had and never quite knew what to do with. And then Substack sort of put them together in a way that made sense, even though at the time it wasn't really adding that much to it. It just suddenly kind of clicked the pieces together, and it was like, oh, that suddenly makes
exactly
more
what
sense.
you mean. Yeah.
So I was like, oh, I'll give that a go. And it kind of meant starting from scratch, because Wattpad being Wattpad, it's a walled garden type platform. You can't easily take people from there to anywhere else other than just saying, please come and check out my newsletter. So yeah, it started basically from nothing. And I just started my next serial project on Wattpad, on the Substack, and just started putting it out every week via this newsletter to, started off 10 people, then 50 people. And it just sort of kept growing over time. It'll be 4 years in now, and there's like 9,000 subscribers. And it's really interesting, because over on Wattpad, you get these like crazy numbers that you start seeing, where it's like, tens of thousands of people are reading it, and you've got over 100,000, but you're never quite sure like who these people are, where they've gone. It's all a bit ephemeral, I suppose. Whereas Substack is at its heart a newsletter platform, and it's subscriber based. You know who your subscribers are. You have that list. You can leave Substack and take it with you if you want. But it means that a smaller number ends up being a lot more meaningful, because all of those 9,000 people, one way or the other, have at some point gone, oh, I'll subscribe to this person. They don't all read every week, obviously, but there was a conscious decision there at some point, and that makes it a completely different kind of setup, I think. And it feels like you're building something a bit more concrete, and the success you might have feels more owned, I suppose, like it was something that you actually did. And
Yes.
Substack itself helps. They have some interesting kind of behind the scenes stuff going on in terms of subscriber growth and what have you, but ultimately it still comes down to the subscriber going, yes, okay, I'll subscribe. So that there's always that human person at the other end.
Yeah. Yeah, that's amazing. And then it did actually start to become something that was providing some meaningful income for you. And so
Yeah.
what was that journey like?
Well, that was the next unexpected thing, I suppose. So Wattpad doesn't really have any monetization. Fiction, like regardless of how you're publishing stuff, whether you're like traditionally published, self-publishing, doing it through fiction doesn't make much money, basically. Like you have the kind of crazy tier, like Stephen King level people who are like insanely successful. Then you have the next level where you have professional writers who are maybe traditionally published and do very well, but they probably still teach or make extra money doing festival tours or whatever else it is they're doing. It's very hard to actually make a living, I suppose. And then you've got everyone else, which is like 99% of all writers who make basically nothing at all. And I was quite comfortable being in that position, because it wasn't something that I'd ever approached with an entrepreneurial mindset, I suppose. It was very much like, I want to tell some stories. I want to do this anyway, even if there's only one person reading. So the fact that it turned into something where there's more than one person reading was lovely. But then the next thing was having people start to pay to read it.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting one because I put it all out for free. Like, you don't have to pay. There's no kind of paywall gateway or anything like that. So you don't really get anything for paying to subscribe to my particular newsletter. Like, some people obviously do go down that route. So that kind of ends up in the situation where I'm like, oh, people are paying because they sort of want to, or in a kind of patron supporter kind of way. And that actually took quite a bit of getting my head around, because you have kind of massive imposter syndrome when you get into that situation, because when no one's paying you and you're just doing it for fun, you're like, oh, this is fun. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, hang on, these people think well enough of what I'm writing to kind of open their wallets in a small way. And then you want to actually deliver something good to them. But then you have this whole other set of questions that comes along where you're like, oh, well, if you publish a particular thing and then you get a load of paid subscribers come through, like, if you approach it from a business standpoint, you should probably look at that and go, oh, I should do more of that. But actually, is that the thing you want to do? Is it going to take you away from actually the core of the purpose of what you're up to? And these are all questions that I didn't even have to think about before. And then all of a sudden, you're kind of like, having to think, why am I doing this? What's the point? And then, we live in an era, I think, where it's very much like hustle culture and everyone's an entrepreneur and trying to make money from what they're doing. Whereas when I grew up, like in the 90s in the UK, like, there was the whole concept around selling out and like not selling out, and like proper artists didn't sell out and all this kind of stuff, even if it meant struggling and being penniless your whole life. And like, it feels like there's an in between somewhere. But yeah, kind of trying to figure out where I want to be in that is an interesting one. And in terms of the paid subscribers, like, it's not kind of life changing. I still have the day job, but all of a sudden, through writing stuff that I would be writing anyway, which I love writing, it's kind of topping up my income each month in a sort of, not exactly a passive way, because it's a hell of a lot of work, but like, I'll be doing it anyway. So yeah, it's very exciting.
Passive in that sense, right? You would be you're driven by something different than making money from this endeavor. In fact, when we talked, it sounded like you weren't really like marketing it, saying, hey, you just kind of incidentally turned on subscriptions at some point and all of a sudden people started signing up for it.
Yeah, it's a weird one. And like, there's all sorts of things you can do. You can put stuff behind paywalls. You can, because I mean, to explain the newsletter, like on Fridays, basically I put out some fiction, and then on Mondays I put out a kind of how-to like thing where I basically share my experience and any tips I've picked up along the way. So that's for other people who are writing fiction, and in particular, wanting to write serial fiction. And that's the sort of thing where I could paywall a lot more of that. And I've sort of experimented a little bit with it, but quite often when I do that, it just doesn't quite feel right. Because most other writers who find that sort of stuff useful are in a similar position where they're not making any money from their writing, yet.
Yes.
The kind of person, a lot of people who read my newsletter will be people who are starting out, trying to figure out what on earth they're doing, how to do it, and sort of immediately forcing them to pay to learn all that stuff just seems a bit mean. I might do like an advanced course or something at some point, which is like a slightly different packaged thing. But I like putting out as much as I can for free.
Yeah, I can totally picture that. And also, having done this a bit myself, I feel that tension sometimes, right? Because you have something you're trying to do in the world. You were going to do it in the world anyway, whether anybody was going to pay you or not. This is what you wanted to do in the world, and you were going to do it. And then all of a sudden you realize, oh, well, some of this I can monetize. But does that fit with the overall mission and the overall dream? And that just requires some work to be self-consistent, I think, and not to let kind of the capitalistic way things are done kind of just crowd in on your heart. I don't know. I feel it. Like, I know what you're talking about, and I respect. I love your approach, man. I think more people need to see and know that there are creative people that are wrestling with these kinds of things. And I think coming to a conclusion like, I think my default is just free. I think that's my default.
Yeah. But I think the other thing, like, because if the main thing you're doing is trying to tell stories or do some art in some way, as soon as you start paying more attention to like the revenue chart and trying to make sure it's going up, and subscriber counts and all this kind of thing. Like, they're interesting and useful because they do tell you something about what you're doing. But the tension, again, the risk is that becomes the reason you're doing stuff. Yes. And actually, that's a very slippery slope that you can go on. And it could result in, you know, massive financial success, in which case that's kind of cool in a different way. But it could also lose the core of what you're doing and actually result in it all kind of falling apart.
Well, see, and that's how we talk, right? Like, people that are creative and that are like truly in their heart seeking to create beauty in the world or create something of worth or of value or of interest in the world. That's kind of how we talk, right? We're like, well, we don't, whatever that thing is, that little golden thing that is the authentic heart of what we're trying to do, we're sensitive about letting that get corrupted. And it's hard to find the language to put on top of that, because even what is that thing, right? Is it wrong to monetize? No, it's not even wrong to monetize, but you still feel this danger that monetization can be at odds with authenticity, right? And so you could do something less authentic that could maybe make more money if you were willing to trade your authentic self or your authenticity for that, if it was worth the fee. Mm-hmm. You know, I don't know. What would you say that is? Like, what, like you've, even your story, you were creating for years before you got a dime for it, right? You were creating consistently over years, producing content that you wanted to produce. What drives you? Like, what is the drive under that sustains you to keep doing that, even as you entered into this more busy stage of life? How did you stay doing it?
Yeah, I think something that I only realized later on, once I've been doing it for a while, is that it is a critical part of how I process the world generally. When I don't write, like, if, you know, for whatever the reason might be, like if I don't write for a couple of weeks, which hasn't happened for years, but like if that did happen, and I remember, like, even if it goes for a few days without doing something, I start to get a bit grumpy, I feel a bit more stressed, and everything feels like it's piling on a little bit, whether it is or not. And it's kind of recognizing that actually the process of writing, and particularly writing fiction, is like my way of handling what's happening in the real world. Yeah. Partly for my own processing, but also then, so, you know, for example, politics is complicated at the moment, right?
Right.
And there's, to put it mildly, but there's various ways you can deal with that. And I feel like 15 years ago, I might have gone on Twitter and just like rah, 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 tweeted out a load of stuff and then felt momentarily better about it. But actually it was completely pointless. Whereas what I would do now is I would take whatever's bothering me, and that would become a theme that I would then explore in some kind of analogous or metaphorical way through science fiction or fantasy or what have you. And that feels healthier to me, but also I hope it's more useful more widely to, in a community sense, because actually me going on Twitter, or these days going on Blue Sky or whatever it is, and just like saying my opinion, it's not very useful. Like, it doesn't help anyone. Whereas actually, if I explore that through a story, some people are going to read that, and they're going to be coming at it from a variety of different viewpoints, right? Some people might have the same opinion that I do on whatever that topic is. Some people won't. Some people have a completely opposite viewpoint. But I think when you apply a fictional lens to that kind of stuff, and sometimes particularly if you apply a kind of speculative fiction, sci-fi, you take a couple of steps back, and then kind of everyone can read the story and enjoy it as a piece of entertainment, but then also have some questions provoked and some thoughts bubbling up. And it's not necessarily about changing people's minds, but it's about getting people to think about it. Whereas I think that's the power of fiction, because it lets people come into it regardless of where their starting point is. Whereas, you know, if you are reading an opinion piece in the newspaper or on a website, like immediately there's an opinion there and a stance, and you either agree with it or you don't, and everyone's really angry straight away. So I think that's kind of where I find value in it. But then also it's about, you know, at the end of the day, I end up feeling better for it as well, because I've kind of worked it through in my brain, and it's it's emerged in some sort of fictional capacity, and then everything makes sense to me a bit more.
Yeah. It reminds me somewhat of a quote I heard, and I don't know the actual quote by Rilke, that, in the letters to, you familiar with Rilke at all? Letters, so. Gosh, famous poet. Gosh, I don't know much about him. I just know that his reading was kind of required reading in the poetry track. And he wrote letters to a young poet. I think that might be the name of his book, even, like Letters to a Young Poet or something like that. And he was basically saying, don't write unless you have to, right? Like, you're basically, if you're a poet, if you're the kind of person that writes because you can't not write, basically. You write because it's who you are, because you have to. And so he's very idealistic language, very far-reaching language, but I think there's a core of truth in that, right? Like, we are somewhat compelled to write these things, whether it's fantasy or whatever the art form is. There is a compulsion that's somehow maybe even linked with our deep identity of who we are. And if you're not doing it, then your being will remind you that you're not doing it. For you, it was the grumpies. You get the grumpies.
Yeah, exactly. And I think different people get this in different ways. Some people will probably do the same sort of processing through sport, for example, or just going for a walk, or exploring, traveling, or whatever it may be. But for me, it's writing.
The other parallel I'm going to bring is my wife is a teacher. She teaches high school, and she sees her job. She's a great teacher. First of all, she's like one of those one in a million teachers who, like, kids are transformed in her presence because she loves them, and because of the way she goes at education. She doesn't see herself as her job as to teach kids content or to teach kids facts. She sees her job as to teach kids how to think for themselves, right? Mm-hmm. And so I say this because even the way you describe the difference between posting on Twitter in a didactic way, like, this is what's right, this is what's wrong, you should be doing this, this is terrible, and this is what you should think about that, right? That is a way, is to go on Twitter and just post what everyone should think. And then there's this other way, which is to attack it through story. And when a person is engaged in a story, we're generally not feeling like this is an interaction in which someone's trying to imprint something on us or to make us think a certain way. They're inviting us into something interesting to consume and to taste and to think for ourselves. And so I suspect, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, but I suspect that is why story can be more effective for attacking some of these hot button issues, because you're inviting someone into a conversation instead of just telling people what to think. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's incredibly powerful, and it can be used to explain and illuminate things. It can be used in a cynical way to manipulate people. But yeah, people are just very susceptible to stories. But I think they can be helpful if they're used in an honest kind of way. But that's what all companies are sort of chasing storytelling, right? And political parties and politicians. Like, everyone's desperate for a bit of storytelling, and often don't know what they're doing. But yeah, I think stories at their core, and when they're being used in a non-cynical kind of way, like regardless of whatever the purpose is, can be really helpful. I think we've all read books or watched movies where you kind of come away from it with a slightly changed view of the world, and it's often not the ones that kind of hammer you over the head, and like the movies where it's like, we're going to win lots of Oscars and make big points about the world and that kind of thing. Often it's the ones you don't expect, where they make little observations here or there, or explore a theme in an intelligent way, and that's where it really imprints on you. So yeah, it depends how you do it, but yeah, stories make the world go round, I think.
Well, even to put a word on that, it sounds like authenticity is important to you.
Yeah, I think so. Because again, like we were saying earlier about when having paying subscribers becomes a thing, an option, it can be very tempting to chase that. And it's the same with stories. Like, do you write a book because it's the trending genre and thing, at that particular moment. You know, like when Twilight was the big hot thing, and then suddenly everyone was writing like vampire stuff. Like, do you do that, or do you actually write stories that you want to write because they mean something and have some importance to you? And I think I try and go down that route, partly because if I was to kind of slightly more cynically try and pursue the market or something, like it'd be so boring, because the way it'd be so incredibly boring to write. And my main thing when I'm writing is that I have to be entertained by what I'm writing, because if I'm not, then no one else is going to be either. And the way I write and publish, where I'm putting out a new chapter each week, like Tales from the Triverse has been serializing each week for 4 years now, and it's nearly wrapped up. That's a long time to be working on something and putting it out into the world and having readers coming along. So it sort of has to, like, if I was kind of skewing this way and that to try and chase trends and do what I thought people would like and thought was cool, like, it's not really going to work, because people are going to detect that over that long period of time. Whereas if I just do the thing that I want to do, people who like that will come along and read it, and people who don't won't, and that's far easier for everyone concerned, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I can imagine, like, it's already a hard thing to write a great story. It's hard. And if you introduce all these other competing considerations into that, that just makes it even harder to write anything that even meets your standard, right? So in how would you define great fiction? And what's the target what's the standard you're trying to reach with what makes great fiction?
That's a big question, isn't it?
Hard one. Sometimes
it's a tricky one, because, like, I think everyone has a slightly different, it's like the what is art question.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure there's any proper answer, but like the kind of stuff that I like to write is, I want it to be entertaining and like fairly easy to read. Like, I prefer to, if there's any challenge in it, I prefer that to be in the themes and what the story is exploring, rather than in the style of the prose, I suppose. That's kind of my angle on it. But I want it to be meaningful as well. I very much write about, like, in my opinion, all great science fiction is about actually current times, even if it's set, 4,000 years in the future or whatever. And that's kind of what I love about the sci-fi genre, because if you look at it at any point, you look at science fiction written in the 50s, and it's about stuff that was bothering people in the 50s. And go to the 70s and etc. It's all these little time capsules of what people thought about the future and the present, and and dealing with stuff like that. In terms of great literature, I think I think that's just up to readers in a way.
Yeah.
Each individual one.
Yeah. Who are some of your influences? The writers that you could consider great in your genre?
I grew up with like Isaac Asimov and some Arthur C. Clarke and classics like that. And then I still am. Kim Stanley Robinson is a fantastic sci-fi writer who's kind of gone down the sort of eco sci-fi route, and his stuff's like super dense in terms of its sort of hard sci-fi leanings. But I think over time he's found increasingly elegant ways to match that with character and theme and that kind of stuff. J. Michael Straczynski I've always enjoyed. He wrote a lot of TV stuff. He wrote the show Babylon 5 back in the 90s, then went into comics and has done novels. Yeah, I love his stuff. And actually his approach to serialization is a big influence in terms of, like, structurally, I suppose. Like, a lot of what I write is heavily influenced by the stuff that he did back then. These days, I probably put Kieran Gillen pretty top of the list. He's primarily a comics writer. He kind of emerged out of the gaming press, and then went into comics and has written amazing stuff, both for like Marvel and also his own independent work. But again, like, a lot of these writers write in serial form. Yeah. Something I always noticed sort of accidentally, like whether it's Straczynski, particularly with his TV work, or comics writers, which, like, comics are inherently kind of serialized. A lot of the writers I'm particularly fascinated by are those serial writers, because I think I not only enjoy the stories they're telling, but I have a sort of analytical eye of how they're structuring it, chapter by chapter, and how they're handling individual episodes versus long ongoing plots across seasons and this kind of stuff. That kind of narrative structure is a thing I'm always intrigued by.
Yeah. So contrast for me the serial format, right? The serial fiction format versus kind of the standard, I don't know what you'd call it, traditional, novelist route.
Yeah.
Pluses and minuses, like what's harder, what's easier, what's your experience?
Yeah, well, I think certainly the one I've been writing at the moment, Tales from the Triverse, like anyone who, like the way I introduce it to people is it's much closer to watching a TV show or reading a comic, I suppose, than it is to reading a novel. Even though it's prose fiction, so on the surface it looks more like a novel, I suppose. Like the actual structure of the storytelling is much more TV-like. But in terms of some of the pros and cons, like a novel, generally, the manuscript is finished, edited, polished up. If you're traditionally published, it goes through an agent, goes through editors, goes through the publishing house. It's polished so well, and then at some point it appears on a shelf, and there's the finished thing. That process can take months or probably years. With serialization, and particularly the way I do it, it's much more kind of hot off the press kind of thing. There's different ways of doing it. Like some people will write the whole manuscript and then after they've done that, put it out chapter by
Release
chapter.
It that way. Yeah.
Which is the sane, sensible way to do it. Like that's the way that you probably should do it. Yeah. The way I do it is I write and publish as I go. So I'm writing a chapter and publishing it just continuously for 4 years in the case of the current one, which is a bit mad at times. But I love the immediacy of it and the fact that I've got readers who were there at the start 4 years ago and are still reading it, and they've kind of come on this story with me, and each time they're leaving comments about like what they think might happen. And again, it's more like a TV show. So when producers on a TV show are making season 1 and they're making those episodes, and then season 1 comes out on TV, like they haven't made season 4 yet. So it's a live living thing that
yes,
they're trying to wrangle over time, and they're trying to predict where they're going, but an actor might leave or get hit by a bus or something, and then they're like, what do they do with the story, because that character can't be in it anymore. And I don't have some of those concerns, but it's a similar thing in that it feels like a kind of live, organic thing that is going to shift over time. So it's really exciting, but there's also obviously a lot of traps that you could fall into in terms of messing up your continuity or your plot or backing yourself into a corner. And I'm very upfront with readers that it probably won't be as polished as a book they just bought in a bookshop. But the exchange, I suppose, is that they're there for the creation of the thing, which for a certain type of reader is really exciting.
That's so cool. I suspected that, but even what you just highlighted are, I think, distinctions that nobody would know unless you discussed them, right? Unless they heard, you're creating worlds for me just by talking, of understanding the difference between this and that. So have you ever written yourself into a corner, like during this 4-year journey? Like, have you had to recant a chapter, or has anything like that ever happened?
Nothing too drastic. I've had a few. So like really early on when I first started doing it, I did have one continuity error where one character was really badly injured and lost an arm, and then like a few months later I wrote a chapter in which he was clapping. And the reader was like, how's he clapping? And I was like, oh yeah. So that was quite awkward. But like that's an easy fix. That was just like a sentence where I changed it, and it was just me not thinking straight at that particular point. Where it gets more interesting is if like I've never got stuck, but I have sometimes written something that then several chapters later I'm like, not sure that was quite right, or maybe there was a problem with it. But what I think where this gets really interesting with serialization in particular, and the way I do it, where I publish as I go, is that I commit to not going back and changing it. Like if there's a typo or just an actual mistake, I'll fix that. But I won't change plot because it's not fair to the readers. But what that means is, if I was writing a novel in a more traditional way and doing the whole manuscript, if I was doing it that way, what I would do is I would go back and change it, and I would edit it, and it goes through several drafts, and that's how you end up at the finished version. With this, because I don't do that, I then have to creatively figure out how to fix it. And that has often led to really interesting new story ideas or character developments or what have you, that I just wouldn't have arrived at if I'd just gone back and fixed whatever the problem was. So the fact that it's set in stone then forces you to go down unexpected routes, which can actually result in some of the best stuff. So from that point of view, it's, that's something some writers I think will be missing out on because they can just go back and fix it. So kind of committing to what you've already written is an interesting, different way of approaching a story.
Oh my goodness, man! See, now that gives me pumped, because like it's almost like you've given yourself some permission to be unpolished or to be imperfect, in retrospect, and you haven't given yourself the permission to go back and polish that and fix it, in the traditional way, which is just make it like it never happened, right? Which then puts this special kind of pressure on you as a creator to find different ways. But also, I'm assuming sometimes you got to just leave something there that wasn't how you would have wanted it to be. And you thought better of it now, but you can't do anything about it because it's there.
Yeah, exactly. And there's nothing stopping it. If you're doing a serial like the way I do, once it's complete, you can take that and then edit it as much as you want, and then publish it as an ebook or a paperback, or do something else with it, and then you can do all those changes in whatever way you want. But like one nice example was, I won't go into the detail of it, but there was a whole thing to do with the way magic worked in Tales from the Triverse that I put in the very, very first chapter, and then like 4 years or 3.5 years later, I was like, I think it was a reader actually, just like they were just thinking about working through the stories and speculating, and they were like, oh, how did this happen? Because if that did that, then that's not how Starlight works. And I was like, yeah, they've got a point, actually. It's something I hadn't even thought about. And again, it's something where it was a single sentence in the prologue, but that was already published 3 years earlier, so I wasn't going to go and change it. So what I ended up doing was, and this is something we can talk about in terms of the Substack community, because that's the other angle of why Substack is really interesting. I basically put out a call and said, are there any physicists in the room? Because I need to talk to you about this problem I've got. And I had like 5 people get back to me, and I sent them they weren't necessarily readers of my stuff at all, but I said, I've got this ridiculous fantasy made up magic logic problem that I've got myself into, and I think there's probably a real sort of real made up physics way out of it, but I need to talk to people who actually know what they're talking about. So I sent each of these people this kind of explanation of the problem I'd got myself into, and because they're all highly enthusiastic physicist type people, I got these like essays back explaining like how light travels and how like quantum tunneling works and all this kind of stuff. And I was like, oh, okay. And again, I wouldn't have had those conversations and ended up with this really interesting solution to the problem if I'd just gone back and edited that sentence. So yeah, that was cool.
Absolutely amazing. That was the next question I was going to ask was, do your readers in your community help form the product because they're involved during the actual creation and giving feedback? And it sounds like the answer is yes. There is a certain amount of feedback that you actually are willing to hear and respond to.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's a few aspects to it. So there's the writing community, which is very vibrant on the Substack, which is not necessarily people who are reading my work. Everyone has limited time, so we don't necessarily read each other's work, but we all write. So we're constantly sharing what we're up to and techniques, and if someone gets stuck, then we can help each other out and all that kind of stuff. So that's just a really great support network. But then in terms of readers and feedback that way, you have to be a little bit careful, because if you just do what they're saying, then you end up in this kind of crowd pleasing mentality where your own work turns into fan fiction almost, and then no one's actually going to be happy because you're just sort of taking the easiest route and trying to satisfy people. So you've got to stick to the core of what you're doing, but it doesn't mean you can't get some good ideas out of it. So again, another reader was just picked up on a character who was only in one chapter. I didn't think that much about them, but they were, for some reason, really fascinated by this character. I was never going to bring them back, but they kept going on about it for like years. Like, what happened to this character? And I was like, I don't care. But then I got to a point in the story, like 3.5 years in, where it suddenly made sense. I was like, oh, actually, I could bring that character back and do this whole sort of tangent story about what happened to them, which I did. And it was like a 4-part storyline, which I think turned out really nicely. And I probably wouldn't have thought to do that if they hadn't sent that feedback in. What actually happened in the story was nothing like what they expected. But yeah, it was that little voice in the back of the head from them that I think put the seed in there, and then that's how that ended up happening. So yeah, there's all sorts of interesting opportunities you can use to have that kind of interaction, that conversation.
Well, it's very confirming for me. I really believe, kind of at my core, I'm a connector. I believe in the power of connection, the power of community. And I do believe there's a certain level of excellence or a certain level of greatness that cannot be achieved apart from vibrant community. And so it's very interesting for me to hear how that plays out for you on Substack, because it's different. I think about, C.S. Lewis and the Inklings and Tolkien, and, who would any of them have gone to gotten the level of fame or success that they got separately if they did not know each other? And I think there are many movements or moments in history where you can find the seed of greatness happening within community and, accentuating and amplifying each other's voices. And for you, it's happened. I can see it happening, but in different ways that are now available to us through these different technologies and through Substack and through the way you've leveraged the community and the way that you've chosen to publish, which is risky, right? Like I'm going to put myself out there every week, and I actually don't necessarily know exactly what's going to happen a year from now, or even 6 months from now, or maybe even next week. I don't know how hairy it gets for you.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's just there's something beautiful about that. Just noting that, and hearing about the way it's worked out for you.
Yeah, no, it's great. And I think I sometimes feel like it's something that, like, a more traditionally published novel writer sort of misses out on, because it's all done behind closed doors, and then the book appears and readers buy the book, but they don't necessarily ever hear from the reader. And for some writers that's completely fine. That's how they like it, which is cool. But yeah, I love the way the serial kind of fiction scene works. I think it's really fascinating and endlessly surprising in the interactions you have with people.
Are there other serial sci-fi writers on Substack or elsewhere that you follow and enjoy their work? Or are you pretty unique?
No, there's a whole bunch. I felt in 2021 when I started on Substack, I felt like I was fairly on my own, I suppose. Substack's exploded in popularity over the last couple of years, like in all avenues, not just in fiction. But there's a lot of fiction writers around now. It's hard to know. Like, if you start listing them, then you just miss out on a whole lot of other people.
I don't want to. Maybe the question is more: are there others? And it sounds like there's plenty of others.
There's tons, and I'm only vaguely aware of some of them, to be honest. Like, you're constantly seeing people who are writing stuff, or maybe who have shown up and are kind of like, oh, I'm thinking about writing a serial. How does that work? And it's quite gratifying that quite often I get tagged in those conversations where someone's like, oh, you should go and check out Simon's stuff. He's got loads of tips. And then that way you find out about a new person who's about to go and give this a go. So yeah, it's kind of constantly expanding. You don't have to look too far to just end up going down this rabbit hole of fiction writers. That does make it a bit tricky, because their fiction category at the moment, like if you go to the fiction category, the top 10 is mostly not actual fiction. It's people writing about fiction. So there's some kind of UX problems with Substack from the reader perspective at the moment. Like, it's amazing as a writer. As a reader, there's all sorts of little frustrations, but I think they're working on it. So fingers crossed we'll see some improvements there.
Yeah. So are you finding a fair amount of people that are coming to you that are, you 10 years ago, and they're like, hey, I think I want to start doing serial fiction on Substack, and can I even do that? Is this the right platform for that? Is there a better way to do it? Are those people coming? Are you finding those people coming to you for advice and for course material, things like that?
Yeah, there's definitely people showing up who are at that point. After I'd been doing this for a couple of years on Substack, I suppose, I started to get other people saying to people, "Oh, you should go and check out Simon's work." That was quite unnerving because I was, happily just writing my stuff quietly in the corner, and some people had come along to read it, which was lovely. But when other people start pointing at you as a trusted resource, I suppose, I'd not really had that before, not in a personal capacity, and that was a weird kind of pressure when that started. Kind of got used to it. I mean, it's a nice thing, obviously, it's really great. But yeah, when you suddenly realise that there's people looking at you who you weren't aware were looking at you, that is a bit strange.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I see that there's offerings for people like that now, right? Like that's part of, you've incorporated some of that into, you're both doing and showing people how to do and advising people how to do, at least through your content. And then I'm assuming maybe on an individual 30-minute chat basis, that's happening sometimes too, right?
Yeah, so I've got like a toolkit of resources, and sometimes I'm writing about software and tools that are useful. Sometimes it's about story structure. Sometimes it's just the very fine detail of like how you lay out a post so it's easy for people to read, that kind of thing. I've got like a 20-part guide on writing serial fiction, all this kind of stuff. There's tons of stuff which is built up over the last 10 years, which is one of the benefits of writing and publishing frequently, or consistently rather, is that at some point you suddenly have this massive back catalogue of useful stuff that you can point people at. So yeah, that's what they are. I've got some like video tutorials and that kind of thing. But the thing for me that was always quite important was to have the two sides of the newsletter. So you've got the kind of how-to writing advice stuff, but there's so much of that on the internet, and on Substack included. And you sometimes get the feeling that the people writing that stuff have never actually written a book. Or the only book they've written is a book about writing a book, and it's all slightly recursive and a bit odd. So something I always wanted to do was to have that, but also to be actually publishing a fiction serial, because that way, like anyone who stumbles upon one of my sort of how-to type articles, if they want to see what I'm actually doing, they can go and check it out and then decide for themselves if I know what I'm talking about, rather than just kind of taking it on trust or what have you. And vice versa. Some people will just come along for the fiction, might not be interested in the how-to stuff, or they might be interested in a bit of both, but it's all there as an option. But I think having that dual strand where you've got the explainer stuff, but also the demonstration of it in practice, I think that's handy.
Yeah, that is unique. But it sounds like that was intentional from the start, because it's called Write More with Simon K. Jones, right? So you obviously, it seems to me, always intended to be talking about how to do it and also do it at the same time.
Yeah. So I've been
otherwise
writing...
you would have called it Tales from the Triverse, but you didn't call it that.
Exactly, yeah, because I've been writing on Wattpad for 5 years or something like that, before I started the Substack. And the Substack newsletter was the first time I kind of added this weekly kind of how-to non-fiction angle to it. And calling it Write More was because I wanted to make it clear that, if somebody wanted to be a better writer, and wanted to study literature and modes of writing, then they can go to university, they can study online courses. There's other teachers who are much better qualified to teach the art of writing, I suppose. And the thing I was very much focusing on was the sort of productivity end and just writing more. That's what I was like, that's actually the point. Because I'd always struggled with never finishing projects. That was my whole thing. Yes. Before I started down this serialization route, I'd always be dabbling with stuff, but I'd never finish anything. And it was only when I started serializing, and you had that kind of weekly commitment, even if it was just one reader, I was like, oh, that guy is waiting for the next chapter, so I better go and get on with it. And it was like this little productivity hack in my brain. And I've been writing ever since. And my thinking was, there might be other people for whom their brains work in similar ways. So that's what the point of this is. It's not about me teaching anyone how to be a great writer. It's about just teaching them how to write more stuff. because
Yes.
you can't become a great writer without just writing consistently. If you're not writing consistently, you're never going to get really good, because so much of it is just down to practice. So the writing lots of stuff is the bit that I try and help people with. And then once they've cracked that and they've got over their writing block and they've got past any hesitation they have about how good they are or whatever, and they're just getting some words down, then they can focus on actually becoming a really good writer. That's the idea. Anyway.
It's so good, man. I can't go into this now because we don't have time, but that is core to why I write, and kind of what the gift I think that I have to give to the world as well was what happened to me. When my stepson Isaiah was in college and was deeply impacted by an art teacher, and the art teacher said, art is blue collar work. You clock in, you put the marks down, you clock out. And that transformed him. That statement transformed him because, it became now attainable for him to become an artist and a writer and all the things that he wanted to become, because it's like, no, you don't wait for the muse to strike all the time.
Yeah.
It's not about that. It's do it more, put the marks down, clock in, clock out, put the marks down. And that's how you angle your way to greatness, or what greatness might not even be the goal, right? Just angle your way towards competence or enjoyment, right? Like all those things. So anyway, I have one last question for you, and we're about to be overtime, but what's your big dream? Where are you heading? Where are you angling? What would you like to see as the fruit of your labor?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I think because I've had sort of different types of successes in ways I didn't quite expect, I've had to think about that a bit. And like we were saying earlier, when some of the paid subscribers came in, I was like, oh, actually, is that the dream? And part of me would love for the newsletter to do well enough that the ratio of my week becomes more of that and less of the day job, much as I enjoy my day job. But, if you can tilt it towards the writing, that'd be amazing. But then I'm like, well, but to get to that level of income through a newsletter and a fiction newsletter, like what would I have to do to get to that point? And would I actually end up hating it in the process? So that's a thorny question. I think as long as I'm still telling stories and people are finding them, like I'm fairly content. But then I suppose, like something that I've always liked, because back in my 20s, like I mentioned, I worked for a tech startup that was making really cheap visual effects software for like young filmmakers, kids, anyone who had no budget, basically. And the thing that came out of that was the most satisfying was some of those kids went on to be some of the big YouTube stars of today. But I knew them when they were like 11, and they were making stuff in their backyard, and they used the software from that company. So that was all about the community building there. And, having that small part of writing some documentation for the software and doing tutorials that were quite entertaining and taught them how to do some cool stuff. Like, it's a tiny part of who they then went on to become, and they became these successful creative people. And now with the newsletter, I've seen some people who are like, oh, this has been really helpful. I'm now doing a serial story and this is great. And the idea that 10, 20 years from now, there could be some writers who are either very successful or just very happy writing stuff. And there's some small part from when they were like 15 or something where they were like, oh yeah, I read this newsletter. I can't remember what the guy was called, but it was really useful. Like, that'd be nice. That'd be cool.
Yes. Yeah, there's a legacy component, right? Like making an impact in the world towards equipping other people to do the thing that you've loved doing so much. And that that we do get beat down to where we think it's not possible. That's part of my story. When Isaiah told me those things, and it kind of he drew me back into the world of creativity and seeing and remembering myself as a creative. And then it makes you want to give that gift to other people, right?
Yeah. Exactly. And I think is maybe recognizing that it's not just about your own success, but if you can help some other people also have success, that is immensely satisfying in its own way as well. And if you can do both of those things somehow to some capacity, then that's pretty good.
Simon, you're amazing. I'm gonna have to, I'd love to go. I could talk another couple hours with you, but I have another meeting that I'm late for right now. So I've enjoyed so much being with you, Simon. Thanks for joining me.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, thank you.
We got to do this again. And everybody who is with me up to this point, thanks for joining us for this episode, and we'll check you next time. Take it easy.
Thanks for listening.